Walter was born in Cologne, Germany in 1924. He grew up as an average German child who went to school, liked to draw, and loved to play at the park. But soon, Walter learned that he was different. He was still a young boy when the outburst of anti-Semitism occurred in Germany. He was young, but still old enough to know what was going on. He knew what anti-Semitism was and that anti-Semitic events were taking place, but he never understood why. Living in Cologne with his mother, father, and 3 siblings, they used to be accepted and even welcomed in their community. They had a fair amount of money and lived comfortably. Walter was allowed the same privileges as non-Jewish Germans and had his bar mitzvah when he turned 13. But all of a sudden, Adolf Hitler's power grew, his popularity skyrocketed, and his anti-Semitic preachings began to spread quickly. He made horrific stereotypes, claiming that the Jews were like racial tuberculosis of the nations. Hitler quickly gained many followers, and his ideas turned into reality. While Walter was still young, the Nuremberg laws were put into effect. Coming from a family of Jewish ancestors, Walter fell under the law's description of a Jew. He and his family were denied citizenship, their rights were taken away, and they were excluded from German society. Lucky for Walter, he physically did not look like the Jewish stereotypes seen throughout Europe. He did not have a big, prominent nose, nor big lips and a drooping forehead that the Nazis made the Jews out to have. Walter was a boy with light hair and blue eyes, closely resembling an Aryan boy. Even so, people in his town knew that he was Jewish. Because of this, Walter was no longer allowed to go to school or play at his favorite parks. His Gentile friends no longer played with him. Walter always had to be careful when he went out because Nazis were everywhere waiting to attack. Many times he had to sneak home because Hitler youth gangs patrolled the streets armed with knives. They often chased him home and even beat him up because he was Jewish. When Walter was 13 years old, his father was arrested for being Jewish and never seen again. His mother's bank account was closed by the Nazis, leaving his family with no money, and she was left alone to care for her 4 children. She could barely afford to feed them. There was no way she could afford to leave Germany and start a new life for her family. She was left with no choice but to go to the Gestapo and beg for help. Fortunately, they allowed her to take a few marks per week from her own bank account in order to pay for food for her family. Walter began to see many of his friends escaping Germany, being smuggled across the border. He wanted to leave too. November 9th, 1938. Walter was 13 and a half years old on the first day of Kristallnacht. He happened to be visiting his aunt in another German city that day, where he fortunately was not known by the Gentiles. Still, there was no stop to the violence. All hell broke loose. Everything was destroyed. Walter heard the screams and cries of the Jews for help, but he was powerless to do anything. He saw smoke and flames coming out of the local synagogue. He cried as he saw men proudly sporting swastikas laugh as they threw matches on Jewish stores. He returned to Cologne the next day with broken glass and burned down buildings lined the streets. Walter was fatherless, upset, and terrified. He knew that he had to leave Germany. For the Nazis, It wasn't bad enough to exclude Jews from society. It wasn't enough to take their rights away. It wasn't enough to take their money. They had to force the Jews to live in small, confined, dirty ghettos. Luck was on Walter's side when he escaped Germany days before Jews were forced to live in ghettos. Months and months went by before he was reunited with his mother, brother, and 2 sisters. They retold him the horrid stories of how they had to say goodbye to their home and old lives, being forced into the ghetto. They stood in line with hundreds of other Jewish people, bleeding miserably. They soon moved into their small new home, all of them living in one room. Food was scarce, but had to do. Screaming and crying were familiar sounds in the ghetto, along with the looks of fearful faces on the streets. They had to be cautious at all times, awaiting the random Nazi invasions. Nazis began moving everyone out of the ghettos. However, Walter's mother and siblings escaped the ghetto days before its inmates were sent away. He was then lucky enough to meet them in Brussels, Belgium.